Hello everyone, I'm going to continue in this video learning and reading about the history of the Arab world. I understand that this is not going to be of particular interest to a lot of people, but there might be a few of you who want to go back to the history of it and see and try to understand why we are where we are today. Today is the 24th of November 2023. I was going to say 24, my goodness. The reason I am learning and I will be reading it and learning with you is that well, first of all, I find it fascinating, actually, something that I know nothing about, and I'm learning a lot, and I hope you can accompany me in this learning. But also because of course it's affecting us now in the West and throughout the world. But it was complicated in that, okay, so we have as you saw in the previous two videos, we have the Ottoman Empire, which ruled throughout that region and a lot of countries in Europe. We saw in the last video that it had lost already the Christian countries in Eastern Europe. And now we are going to begin to see the seeds of Arab nationalism. In the last video, we talked quite a bit about Egypt, but now it's going to expand. And it's going to expand, and you see, it has the way I understand it, it has a three-prong reaction against the Ottoman Empire. First of all, in the Arab world, they have the increasing influence of the Europeans now, especially England and France, and eventually to a great extent Germany too. But also they have to deal with pan-Arabic divisions, which are going to be mostly secular, and the pan-Islamic Islamist division, which is going to be more along the religious line. And who is going to be in charge? Which denomination, which section of these different interpretations is going to take hold? Anyway, for different readings, I follow different books, but for this particular video, which is I'm going to entitle the Seeds of Arab Nationalism. I'm going to follow exclusively this one, which I have already introduced to you. Yes, The Arabs by Peter Mansfield, which is a book published for the first time in 1976. So let's see what we can learn today. So, the seeds of Arab nationalism. The Egyptian historian Al-Jabarti, who was an eyewitness of Napoleon's invasion of his country, we saw that in the last video, records what happened when the English fleet, which was chasing him, arrived off Alexandria. A small boat was lowered and 10 Englishmen came ashore. They met the notables of the city and told them they were searching for the French fleet. "You will not," they said, "be able to drive them off. We shall stay here with our fleet to defend your port, and we want nothing of you except water and food." That's what the English said. But the notables replied, "This is the Sultan's country. Neither the French nor any other people have any rights in it. Please go away." The notables answered in the spirit of Muslim defiance of the infidel. They did not reply to the Englishmen as Egyptians, still less as Arabs. The Ottoman Empire, for all its weaknesses and failings, which were only apparent to the tiny minority with enough knowledge of Europe for purposes of comparison, was still the protector and preserver of the Islamic Ummah, the community. The only serious challenge to this view from among the Arab peoples before the 19th century came from the Central Arabian deserts in the movement led by Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. He and his followers demanded a return to the pure Islam of its early days. They denounced all the later accretions of saint worship and Sufism, as well as the whole structure of Islamic orthodoxy which had been built up over the centuries and which the Ottoman Empire claimed to represent. They equally attacked the revival of the pre-Islamic practices and beliefs among the desert tribes of Arabia who had never really accepted Islam. Abd al-Wahhab's special wrath was directed towards the Ottoman Sultan and his government, including its ungodly inclination towards the filthy devices of the Frankish infidels, the French. Before his death in 1787, Abd al-Wahhab joined forces with the Ibn Saud, head of a small tribal dynasty in Central Arabia. In 1806, the Wahhabi forces led by the Amir Muhammad al-Saud occupied Mecca and had the public prayers read in his name instead of that of the Ottoman Sultan. This was an Arab movement in that it was inspired by racial pride in the achievements of Muhammad and his followers in the earliest days of Islam, and it was anti-Turkish in that the Wahhabis believed that the Ottoman sultans had forfeited their right to the caliphate. But its appeal was to Islamic rather than Arab solidarity. It was far removed from modern secular Arab nationalism. Goes on for a little while, but contact with the West increased. On the one hand, the young Ottomans were educated or served as diplomats in the European capitals, and on the other, after the European revolutions of 1848, many of the ablest political liberals found refuge in Constantinople and joined the Turkish service. European customs found their way into the capital. The Sultan set the example by wearing European dress and giving dinners and balls in Western style. The trouble was that all these changes, even the introduction of secular law, were superficial because they left the authoritarian power structure of the empire untouched. The reforms were little more than window dressing aimed to catch the attention of Europe. The European powers were interested in the status and condition of the Christian subjects of the Ottomans. Therefore, the reforms were proclaimed as being aimed at the security and happiness of all citizens equally, regardless of religion or race. This is the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. In theory, a totally new Western and secular principle of full equality before the law of all the subjects was being introduced into the Ottoman Empire. But for this to become a reality would have required a revolution of hearts and minds among those who administered the empire. It is worth recording that full equality for non-Protestants had not even been achieved in Britain at this time. The principle of equality was being established by imperial fiat, and because it depended upon the will of the Sultan, who had no intention of giving up any of his authoritarian powers, it could not be genuine. It was rather as if the Bourbon kings of France had formally adopted the principles of the French Revolution. The consequence was that the aspirations for equality and independence among the Christian subjects of the empire were aroused without being satisfied, while the ability of the European powers to interfere in the internal affairs of the empire on the ground that the Christians were suffering from discrimination, these were strengthened. The Balkan provinces, where the Christians were a majority, revolted one by one and either achieved their independence or were absorbed into one of the European states which was supporting them. On the other hand, the Christian communities in the Anatolian provinces, such as the Armenians and the Greeks, could not hope to achieve independence for themselves through rebellion. Ultimately, these were to suffer massacre or expulsion. For those Ottoman subjects who were Muslim but not Turkish, of whom the great majority were Arabs, the crisis of the empire had a wholly different impact and meaning. Since Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt in 1798 first opened a crack through which the ideas of the French Enlightenment might enter the closed Islamic society of the Near East, thoughtful Arabs began to consider the reasons for the evident growth in wealth and power of Europe in relation to the Islamic peoples. The outstanding example in the first half of the 19th century was the Egyptian scholar and writer Rifa al-Tatawi from 1801 to 1873, Rifa al-Tatawi, who was sent by Muhammad Ali as Imam of the first student mission to Persia, and wrote with perception and admiration about French society and its achievements. He noted the cleanliness, the energetic industry and intellectual curiosity of the French people and their devotion to the education of their children. In considering the best means for improving the situation of his own country, he saw the solution in a modern system of education. He not only advocated a return to the study of the rational sciences, as in the days of Arab greatness, and insisted that the ulama, the scholars of Islam, should be familiar with modern developments in this field, but also held that all citizens should be given a political education to foster a social conscience and a sense of communal welfare. These were revolutionary ideas in Islamic society at that time. He even suggested that rulers, although they should be strictly obeyed as in all Islamic societies, should do their utmost to please their subjects and take account of public opinion. But although these were radical ideas, al-Tatawi was not aware of it. Like all his contemporaries, he was concerned with the reform of Muslim society in Islamic terms. His emphasis was not on the introduction of new principles, but on the revival of the virtues of the past. This has been the constant theme of Islamic reformers until the present day. – Tatawi's writings lack a sense of urgency. Tatawi lived and worked in a happy interlude of history when the religious tension between Islam and Christendom was being relaxed and had not yet been replaced by the new political tension of East and West. That is a quote from A. Hourani in Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age. Even the French invasion of Algiers, which took place while he was living in Paris, did not act as a warning of Europe's future domination of the Near East, and he wrote about it in a surprisingly detached spirit. A man who considered many of the same problems as Tatawi was the great Tunisian statesman Khayr al-Din. He also studied and admired Europe's political, social, and economic institutions and proposed that the Muslim peoples should take over the best of them. But, like Tatawi, he always said that this would not mean contravening Islamic tradition and law. He only warned, quote, those who are heedless among the generality of Muslims against their closing their eyes to what is praiseworthy and in conformity with their own religious law in the practice of adherents of other religions, simply because they have the idea engraved on their minds that all the acts and institutions of those who are not Muslims should be avoided. There was certainly no question of abandoning Islam for the sake of progress, because in Khayr al-Din's view, the progress of Europe had nothing whatever to do with its being Christian. Christianity, he says, aims at happiness in the next world and not in this. Quote, if it were a cause of worldly progress, the papal state would be the most advanced and not the most backward state in Europe, he wrote. Similarly, Khayr al-Din did not even consider the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. On the contrary, he took it for granted that it was the protector of the Islamic community. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the crisis of Islam became much more acute. It was no longer possible for Arab intellectuals to take a detached attitude towards the West, as it became apparent that France's occupation of Algiers was not an isolated incident in a relatively remote regency of the Ottoman Empire, but a prelude to the imposition of a Western hegemony along the whole southern coast of the Mediterranean. At the same time, the nature of Arab-Turkish relations and the way in which Arabs looked upon their Turkish rulers underwent a change as the result of the accession to the Ottoman throne of one of the most controversial figures in the modern history of the Middle East, the Sultan Abdul Hamid II. We're going to encounter him quite a few times, Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Abdul Hamid, who for 33 years presided over the affairs of the dwindling empire, the sick man of Europe as it was known, raised high hopes among his subjects when he ascended the throne with his reputation as a devout but enlightened and liberal prince. He appointed a Grand Vizier, Midhat Pasha, a reforming Ottoman statesman of genius who carried the best hope of establishing the principle of equality between the Turkish and the non-Turkish subjects of the empire. Under Midhat, a new liberal constitution was promulgated, which reduced the Sultan's aristocratic powers and provided for the democratic election of a legislative assembly. But it was not long before Abdul Hamid showed his true opinion of both liberalism and democracy. Within a year, he dismissed Midhat. Midhat was recalled to be governor of Syria in 1878, but was arrested 2 years later and put on trial. He died in exile, almost certainly by violence, in 1833. Okay. For the sake of appearances, he, the king, the Sultan Abdul Hamid, he allowed the elections under the new constitution to proceed, and the first Ottoman parliament actually met in March of 1877 with deputies from all parts of the empire. Although the deputies had no parliamentary experience and the elections were held under strong pressure from Ottoman officials, the debates were lively and revealing. As the Istanbul correspondent of the Daily News wrote, it was the first time that representatives from such distant places as Baghdad, Albania, Armenia, and Syria met together. Their discussions were singularly full of interest and even surprises. Though most of the members spoke of serious grievances which required redress in their own district, they were surprised to learn that their own constituencies were not alone as spheres of misgovernment. Such open manifestations of popular opinion were not at all Abdul Hamid's intention. Within a year, he had dissolved the chamber and suspended the constitution. It remained suspended for 30 years. The Sultan then set about reversing the whole process of decentralization of power, which had taken place gradually over the years in the Arab provinces. Through an elaborate system of spies and agents, he endeavored to gather all the reins of government into his own hands in Istanbul and to end the virtually autonomous authority of the local Ottoman governors. He was greatly helped in this by the invention of the telegraph and the railway. But if Abdul Hamid was ruthless, he was also cunning and devious. In his dealings with the Western powers, he had to use all his abilities as a born intriguer to play off one against another, as witness his conduct during the negotiations which led to the British occupation of Egypt. With the Arab provinces, which were still under his control, he was quite prepared to use force if it was necessary to suppress any stirrings of rebellion. But he was ready to try persuasion first. He not only treated Arab leaders with great generosity when they visited Istanbul, but he appointed Arabs to some of the highest positions in the state. One of them, Izzet Pasha, although known contemptuously to the Turks as Arab Izzet, he was his second secretary for 13 years and rose to be the most powerful man in the empire after his master. But Abdul Hamid's principal appeal to the loyalty of his Arab subjects was through the Islamic religion. His predecessors in the 18th century had revived their claim to the Caliphate of Islam, which had become a purely ornamental title. Abdul Hamid went much further to pose as the champion of Islam and the protector of all the faithful, such as the Indian Muslims at the time, today Pakistan. All those faithful living under and other faithful living under Christian governments. It seems that he was persuaded by some leading Arab sheikhs that he had been mistaken in cultivating the friendship of those European Christian governments, and that his real destiny was to reunite Islam against Christendom. He took good care that his reputation for piety should be sustained, and where most of his predecessors had been dissolute, he was straight-laced and strict in his religious observances. He surrounded himself at his court with scholars and divines, subsidized mosques and theological schools, and liberally financed Muslim missionary activities in Asia and Black Africa. All this was, of course, especially calculated to appeal to his Arab subjects. Arabic was still unquestionably the language of religion in the empire. The most famous mosques and institutions of learning were in the Arab provinces. The strength of pan-Islamic feeling was increasing as a reaction to the 19th century invasion of the world of Islam by Christian Europe, and Abdul Hamid sought to exploit it. However, although he had some success with the Arab masses, he was less able to convince the leading thinkers and Islamic reformers. The most influential of these was Jamal al-Din al-Hafani. He's going to be important as one way of seeing Arab nationalism. I'll repeat his name because I just butchered it. He's going to be known as al-Afghani. Al-Afghani, 1838 to 1897. He was a man of electrifying personality and the capacity of a true revolutionary to stir men's hearts and minds. Although almost certainly of Persian Shiite by birth, he himself claimed to be an Afghan Sunni, hence his name, and his principal appeal was to the Muslim majority. The burden of his message was that they should unite in a great pan-Islamic movement. When you talk about pan-Islamic, you are emphasizing, obviously, religion. That they should unite in a great pan-Islamic movement to face the common danger of European expansionism. But his revolutionary temper and the methods he advocated, which included the assassination of despots, constantly placed him in trouble with governments. From 1871 to 1879, he was in Egypt, where, tolerated by the Khedive, the governor, Ismail, he acquired a following of bright young Egyptian intellectuals who included Muhammad Abduh. Abduh is also going to be important. I know I keep repeating the names because I know it's for Westerners a little bit difficult to remember them. One of his this leader is Afghani, and one of his most important disciples, who's going to go in a slightly different way, is Abduh. Okay, so a bright Egyptian intellectual who included among them intellectuals who included Muhammad Abduh, the most enlightened of Islamic reformers of the 19th century, and also Saad Zaghloul, the future Egyptian nationalist leader and champion of the independence movement against the British. Expelled from Egypt by the governor Tifwik, with British encouragement, He went to India and from there to Paris, where he was joined by Mohammed Abduh, so now they're together in Paris, who had himself been expelled from Egypt for his part in the Arabi Revolt, and together they formed a secret society of Islamic reformers and published an influential Arabic periodical translated The Indissoluble Link. From Paris he went to Persia, where he became advisor to the Shah, but was expelled in 1891 when he tried to organize popular agitation against the Shah's plan to grant a tobacco concession to a European company. It was at this point that Abdul Hamid invited al-Afghani to Istanbul with the intention of harnessing his potent influence in support of his claim to pan-Islamic leadership. The consequence was that al-Afghani, while treated with honor, ended his days virtually as the Sultan's prisoner, although he was able to arrange the assassination of the Persian Shah, who deported him. In fact, al-Afghani concept of pan-Islam was incompatible with that of the despot like Abdul Hamid, the Sultan. He believed that it was up to the mass of Muslim peoples to take their destiny in their own hands, to unite and to force their rulers to govern in their interests and defend them against acquisitive foreigners. His most bitter attacks were against those rulers who were only concerned with their own power and privilege. He was a revolutionary in that he introduced a wholly new concept into the world of Islam, that of secular politics. He himself was a skeptic, even an agnostic. For him, the center of attention is no longer Islam as a religion, it is rather Islam as a civilization. The norm of human action is not the service of God, he said, it is the creation of human civilization flourishing in all its parts. The idea of civilization is indeed one of the seminal ideas of the 19th century Europe, and it is through al-Afghani above all that it reaches the Islamic world. Because he understood that the concept of the political solidarity of the Islamic peoples was too remote and abstract for the mass of the people, he also emphasized the need for loyalty towards a smaller unit, patriotism towards the national homeland, Arabic Watan community. He proclaimed the danger of adopting an alien language or culture, for, as he said, a people without unity and a people without literature is a people without language. A people without history is a people without glory, and a people will lack history if authorities do not rise among them to protect and revivify the memory of their historical heroes so that they may follow and emulate. All this depends on a national education which begins with the homeland, the environment of which is the homeland and the end of which is the homeland. It would be wrong to suggest that al-Afghani was the first apostle of modern Arab nationalism. No such concept had formed in his mind, let alone among his small circle of friends and disciples. But if he did not plant the seeds of nationalism, he prepared the ground for the planting, because he transformed the significance with which Islam ought to hold in the life of the Muslim. His political activity and teaching combined to spread among the intellectual and official classes of Middle Eastern Islam a secularist, meliorist, and activist attitude towards politics, an attitude the presence of which was essential before ideologies such as Arab nationalism could be accepted in any degree. The effects of Afghani secular revolution on the outlook of the 19th century Muslims were naturally not instantaneous. The process of transformation took place over many years. In fact, Al-Afghani most famous disciple and colleague, Muhammad Abduh, reacted against his secular and utilitarian view of Islam. After being an active sympathizer with the Arabic revolt in Egypt, for which he was exiled, Abduh went to join Al-Afghani in Paris. But he parted company with Al-Afghani in 1885 and settled in Beirut. There he lectured on theology and interested himself in the state of education in the Muslim schools of Syria, currently in a deplorable condition. In 1888 he was allowed by the Khedive, the governor, to return to Egypt to resume his career in public life. But he did not return to active politics. Like Al-Afghani, he deplored the perversive influence of European culture and material civilization in the Islamic countries, and like him, he thought that much of the fault lay with the despotism of Muslim rulers. But unlike Al-Afghani, he did not advocate revolutionary action to rectify the situation. Instead, he believed in evolutionary change through education. If he was not reconciled to British control of Egypt, he did not actively oppose it. He was the subject of the warm, if somewhat patronizing approval of Lord Cromer, who helped him to the office of Mufti of Egypt, the highest judicial post in the land, which he held until his death in 1905. Abduh was made a judge because the Khedive, the governor, feared his influence on the young. But his real interest was in teaching and educational reform. His approach was broad, liberal, and humane, and his views were always expressed with the gentle benevolence which was characteristic of his nature. His aim was not to reject, but to reconcile and to harmonize. He realized that the existing educational system divided between the ultra-conservative religious schools headed by Al-Azhar and the state schools, which were concerned only with turning out civil servants, was disastrous. He advocated a more comprehensive system in which the curriculum of the religious schools should be expanded and modernized, while that of the state schools should include some moral and religious education. He also proposed that the foreign mission schools, where he rightly believed much of the teaching was inimical to Islamic culture, should be brought under close control. Like all Islamic modernizers who are not secularists, he maintained that there was nothing intrinsic to Islam which is irreconcilable with modern science and philosophy. But like most of those who set out on the hazardous quest for a reconciliation between their faith and reason, he was assailed with doubts. Both Lord Cromer and his friend, the British Arabist and Romantic poet Wilfrid Skewen Blunt, believed that he had lost his faith, in fact. Although Croma described him as the chief hope of liberal Islam in Egypt, he regarded his efforts to reform Al-Azhar as hopeless because, in his view, Lord Cromer's view, in his view, Islam cannot be reformed. That is to say, reformed Islam is Islam no longer. It is something else. We cannot as yet tell what it will eventually be. Croma was right in the sense that Abduh's reforming efforts were ultimately a failure. It is also true that Croma did nothing to help him to succeed. Although the man who effectively controlled Egypt for a quarter of a century indignantly repudiated the charge that the British had done nothing to help education, there can be no doubt that its neglect was the worst feature of British rule in Egypt. Even when Croma had paid off Egypt's debts and the budget was showing a surplus, education was starved of funds. But could Abduh have succeeded even with Croma's moral and material support? The answer is almost certainly that he could not. The truth is that although he was a man of exceptional qualities and powerful influence which long survived his death, he was unable to achieve his aims alone. The reformation of Islam could not be the work of one man. His opponents not only included the religious conservatives, that was to be expected, but also the rising generation of Egyptian nationalists who resented his passive acceptance of British political control, which Abduh regarded as irrelevant to his aims. It follows from this that Abduh can hardly be regarded as a prophet of modern Egyptian nationalism, still less of Arab nationalism. Yet, in one important sense, he was a forerunner of the modern nationalist movement. In his teaching, Abduh constantly harked back to a golden age of Islam when the Muslin community was led by al-Salaf, the great ancestors, and before it was corrupted by all the innovations of medieval Islam, which had since become entrenched tradition. Abduh, like the Wahhabis in Arabia and the Muslim brothers of more recent times, dated the decline of Islam from the time that the caliphs began to introduce Turkish mercenaries to maintain order. Under the despotism of these barbarians, Islamic civilization withered. It is highly significant that in one of his notable memoranda on education to the Ottoman governor of Syria, Abduh strongly recommended against the imposition of Turkish instead of Arabic as a medium of instruction in Syrian schools. As we have seen, the earlier Ottoman sultans had shown their respect for Arabic and its special place in Islam, but at that time education was almost entirely religious. In their educational reforms of the 19th century, the Ottomans tried to impose Turkish as the language of instruction for all subjects other than religion. All the educational subjects other than religion. Language became a means of asserting Turkish domination in the empire. And this aspect of Abduh's idea was developed by one of his outstanding disciples, the Syrian Rashid Rida. Very important too, Rashid Rida, 1865 to 1935. who came to Egypt in 1897 and founded the influential review Al-Manar, the Lighthouse, which he edited for the rest of his life. Like Al-Afghani and Abduh, and indeed all Arab intellectuals of the time, Rida was passionately concerned with finding the reasons for the weakness and backwardness of the Islamic world in relation to the West. Do you see how this continues to be a constant problem there? And even more than Abduh, Rida saw the answer in the disunity of Islam under the Turks. Although the Turks had conquered vast new territories and their empire had lasted much longer than that of the Arabs before them, he did not see this as having been advantageous to the Islamic world. On the contrary, quote, "It is in the countries which were conquered by the Arabs that Islam spread, became firmly established and prospered. Most of the lands which the Turks conquered were a burden on Islam and the Muslims, and are still a warning of a clear catastrophe." This is what he wrote in Al-Manar, the Lighthouse. In another article entitled "The Civilization of the Arabs," he wrote, "To care for the history of the Arabs and to strive to revive their glory is the same as to work for the Muslim union, which only obtained in past centuries thanks to the Arabs, and will not return in this century except through them, united and in agreement with all races." This theme was taken up even more forcefully by another Syrian, Abdul Rahman al-Kawakibi, 1849 to 1902, who came to Egypt from his native Aleppo in Syria in the year after Rida and published 2 books which became the first gospels of Arab nationalism. Like Rida, he asserted that the regeneration of Islam must come through the Arabs, and specifically the Arabs of Arabia, who, he said, had preserved both their sense of freedom and their solidarity, or asabiyya, and suffered from no racial, religious, and sectarian divisions. He went further to say that the Caliph should be an Arabian Arab living in Mecca and presiding over a revivified and unified Islam. It may be seen from this that Rida and Kawakibi's ideas were akin to those of the Wahhabis of Arabia, who had rebelled against Ottoman rule in the early 19th century. Rida, in particular, was an Islamic Puritan and fundamentalist who showed active sympathy with the efforts of the Saudi Wahhabis to unite the Arabian Peninsula under their rule. At the same time, like the Wahhabis, his primary concern was with the regeneration of Islam. Rida was more an Arab Muslim than a Muslim Arab. Interesting. More an Arab Muslim than a Muslim Arab. The emphasis is either on Muslim or Arab. Rida and Kawakibi were pan-Islamists rather than pan-Arabs, although, like Al-Afghani, they helped to prepare the ground for Arab nationalism. They believed that the Arabs should regain the leadership of Islam, but meanwhile, for good or ill, the Sultan was Caliph and the chief protector of the Islamic community. Neither Rida nor Kawakibi were thinking at this stage of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. That the attitude towards the Ottoman Empire of men like Rida, Kawakibi, and other Arab thinkers of the time should be ambiguous was hardly surprising. As we have seen, their chief concern was with the regeneration of Islam in order to throw off the domination of Europe. But they were both Syrians who had left their homes where they had lived under oppressive Ottoman rule. For the relative freedom of British-controlled Egypt. Many other Syrians and Lebanese did likewise. For years, the Cairo press and publishing world was largely dominated by Syrian-born Egyptians. Yet Britain, as the foreign occupying power, was undoubtedly at the same time the enemy, and any national movement in Egypt, whether it was primarily Islamic, Arab, or native Egyptian, was bound to develop as an anti-British force. Egyptian nationalism, which remained dormant for some years after the suppression of the Arabic Revolt, began to revive in the 1890s. It appeared to have found a leader for the time in the young Khedive Abbas II, who succeeded his father Tewfik in 1892 on his premature death at the age of 39. Abbas, the king, tried to assert himself as the head of an independent state and reject British tutelage, but he chose his ground badly, as when he tried to call Lord Kitchener to account for the way he was training the new Egyptian army, and ultimately he was humiliated and reduced to a helpless cipher by the formidable Cromer. Abbas had been encouraged to hope for real support from the Sultan and from Britain's imperial rivals among the powers, especially France, but these remained confined to verbal encouragement, which was of little use when Cromer held the reins of power in his hands. For Abbas, like nearly all the family of the Muhammad Ali of previous years, the love of Egypt took second place to concern for his own autocratic power. Egyptian nationalism had a much more genuine leader in the 1890s in the slender and passionate young French-trained lawyer named Mustafa Kamel, 1874 to 1908. Who, for years before his premature death, succeeded in stirring the hearts and minds of his fellow Egyptian with his speeches and articles denouncing the British occupation. Cromer treated him with contempt, as he did all those he called Gallicized Egyptians, Francophile, By this he meant those young men who had managed to secure a Western university education which, in Cromer's view, cut them off from the real needs of their fellow countrymen and fitted them only to make inflammatory and irresponsible speeches. Lord Cromer, ignored the fact, which was pointed out by some English liberal critics, that it was his consistent refusal to allow educated young Egyptians any responsibility that made them irresponsible. Cromer's disdainful attitude towards Egyptian nationalism helped to foster it. Indeed, Cromer denied the very existence of an Egyptian nation. He and most of his British colleagues held the view that since the European communities, the Greeks, Italians, Maltese, etc., controlled the country's economic life and produced most of its wealth, in contrast to the Gallicized Egyptians, they should be given a preponderant and permanent voice in the country's government. any Egypt for the Egyptians policy was nonsense, said Cromer. The only real Egyptian autonomy is one which will enable the dwellers in cosmopolitan Egypt, be they Muslim or Christian, European, Asiatic or African, to be fused into one self-governing body, he said. Ultimately, Cromer was brought face to face with the reality of Egyptian nationalism by an incident which was a turning point in the British occupation of Egypt and a major event in the annals of European imperialism. In June 1906, some British officers were shooting pigeons near the village of Deshavai. They had been warned not to do so because the villagers there raised the pigeons for food, and a group of the fellahim, the rural peasants, a group of them attacked them, and later one officer who had fled back to his unit was found dead from the combined effect of head wounds and sunstroke. The British soldiers seized the villager standing beside the body and clubbed him to death. In the ensuing uproar, with the British press and the panic-stricken foreign communities demanding exemplary punishment to prevent a peasants' revolt, 52 villagers were arrested and tried, 4 were executed and hanged outside the village, 3 were flogged, and others were sentenced to long terms of hard labor. The bitter resentment among Egyptians at all levels wiped out the memory of the beneficial effects of Cromer's rule, the British rule. Those leading Egyptians, such as the disciples of Ad-Duh, who had been prepared to tolerate, if not to accept, the continuation of the British occupation, were converted overnight, and Mustafa Kemal gained 1 million new followers. But there was one fundamental inconsistency in Mustafa Kemal's position which he never overcame. It's going to be a continuous problem. The hero of Egyptian nationalism was also an enthusiast for the pan-Islamic movement, which in his case meant supporting the rights of the Ottoman Sultan, from whom he expected support. When in 1906 Abdul Hamid, the king, was building his Hejaz railway to Medina, he landed a force at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba and laid claim to the whole of the Sinai Peninsula. Kemal led the nationalists in a vigorous campaign in his support, and it was left to Cromer to champion the British to champion the cause of Egypt's territorial integrity with the help of a display of force by the British fleet. Cromer's concern was to keep the Turks away from the Suez Canal, but there were many patriotic Egyptians who saw no point in abandoning Sinai, which had widely come to be regarded as Egyptian territory, for the rather nebulous cause of Islamic solidarity. This was one of the first and most striking examples of the clash between local nationalism and pan-Islam. In the 20th century, the same type of conflict would arise with pan-Arabism when Syria, Egyptian or Iraqi interests clashed with the cause of Arab unity. In Egypt, it was the local nationalism which predominated over pan-Islam, and until quite recent times over pan-Arabism also. It was to the cause of Egypt for the Egyptians that the politically active devoted their energies during the first half of the 20th century. The pan-Islamic element in Mustafa Kemal's nationalism was more tactical than ideological. He hoped for the support of the Ottoman Sultan against the British. At the same time, he was aware of the danger that it might alienate Egyptian non-Muslims, and he went out of his way to encourage Egyptian Copts, the Catholics, to join his movement. It was not inevitable that Egyptian nationalism or patriotism should triumph over the feeling of Islamic solidarity. As we have seen, the sentiment hardly existed at the beginning of the 19th century. The notables of Alexandria told the British sailors who were chasing Napoleon that Egypt was the Sultan's country. Muhammad Ali secured for Egypt a large measure of independence, but this was to serve his personal ambitions. He could hardly be an Egyptian patriot when he did not regard himself as an Egyptian. In the second half of the 19th century, those who had most influence on political thought, Al-Afghani, Abduh, and their disciples, were intent on reforming Islam rather than securing freedom and independence for the Egyptian nation, even if they were able to understand the powerful influence of national Watani feeling. Colonel Arabi's revolt originated as an army mutiny but developed into a genuine national movement of Egypt for the Egyptians. However, this only lasted a few months before being destroyed at the Battle of Tel Kebir. The building of a new national movement with foundations among the Egyptian masses took place over many years under the British occupation. Leave it there today. Thank you for accompanying me in this learning journey. Bye-bye.